Hi all, I'm Age. Welcome to Liquid Earth, a channel all about video and photography. Today we're looking at the DJI Mini 2 and all of the video modes. If you're new to photography or a beginner, you'll love this. We'll show you all the basic setup. If you're advanced, you'll love this. I'll show you all of the settings that you can play around with. To record, it's very simple. Just make sure you're in the video mode. You have the red circle. To swap between video and photo, you can press this little switch button here. To record, then you simply tap on the red icon or press the button, and to stop recording you do the same thing. By default you'll be in the auto mode, and on the bottom right you can see the settings. Now auto mode is great if you're new to flying or a beginner to photography or video. Stick it in the auto mode, you'll be good to go. However, change a couple of the settings. So the first thing to do is make sure that the resolution is the best quality possible. To do that you can tap on the little icon and you can choose your resolution. 4K is the highest quality available, so I'd recommend that you choose that. If you want to save some space, however, you can go down to 2.7K or 1080p, and they're smaller files but not as great in quality terms. If you're doing slow motion, then you'll need to go to 2.7K and you'll need to choose 60 frames per second, and that'll give you the option in post to slow down your footage up to about 2 times. So back to 4K for normal shooting, you then have your frames per second, FPS. FPS, frames per second, is how many shots it's going to take over 1 second of video. Now traditionally, in the good old days, if you were in the UK or a PAL region, you use 25 frames per second. North America, NTSC regions would use 30 frames per second. Today, it doesn't really matter. All TVs, all devices are more than capable of playing in any frames per second. So, I would recommend choosing something like 4K, 30 frames per second if you're new. If you're experienced, you have all of the options available to you. There is one exception to frames per second. If you're indoors or under artificial lighting, then in PAL regions, UK, choose 25 frames. And if you're in NTSC, North America and other regions, then choose 30 frames per second. Otherwise, you could get flickering with the artificial lights. Other than that, drone footage out and about, 4K, 30 frames per second, great place to start. Under the auto mode, you do have the option to change the brightness and darkness of the video. All you do is you press the little icon that says EV and you've got a scroll bar. To the left it gets darker, to the right it gets lighter. When you get to 0, that's how the camera sees the settings for a good exposure. Doesn't necessarily mean it is. Particularly in sunsets you might want to change to a slightly darker to really bring out those colours in the sky, for instance. But you can have a play around with that depending on your location. If you want to lock the exposure, you can lock the exposure too. So let's say you've got the exposure about right and the lighting conditions aren't going to change. Tap once on the screen, then tap and hold, and you'll see this little lock icon come up. That's locked to the exposure. At the moment I've locked it at 0. If we go to exposure compensation, and I'll move that to a little bit darker, tap on the screen, tap again, we've now locked the exposure at minus 1.3 stops of light. If we tap again, tap and hold, then we can turn the lock back off, or you can just use the exposure compensation and that will automatically turn the lock off for you. You don't have to worry about focusing, it's fixed focus, so everything's going to be in focus for you. Let's go over to Pro mode then. So if you tap on the little icon on the bottom right hand side, you can change from Auto to Pro. And Pro just gives you the parameters to play around with, more settings. So for instance, you've got the shutter speed, you can change your shutter speed to whatever shutter speed you like. You're in manual, so if you're going to lower shutter speeds, you're letting in less light. Higher shutter speeds, you're letting in more light. You have the ISO that you can change. Keeping it at 100 is always good, less grain, less noise. The higher the ISO, the more sensitive the chip is to light, but it's going to introduce grain. So if you go right up, although you can theoretically change your shutter speed to bring down the exposure, shooting at a high ISO isn't a good idea. You should shoot at the lowest possible ISO setting. In daylight, really 100 is where you want to be. Obviously, you can't lock your exposure. There's no point, you're in manual. You're changing your exposure manually by using your shutter speed or your ISO. And on the right hand side, you can see the settings and whether you're plus or minus on what the camera sees as a good exposure. For example, if we take the shutter speed and we move that, you can see that the exposure value starts to change. It thinks we're 2 stops under now, and that's pretty accurate, isn't it? It's dark. and then we're a couple of stops or so over now, so it's too light. But in this scenario, so we've got a bright sky and we've got darker foreground. What do you want to expose on? If it's the sky, then you want to make it a little bit darker, and if it's the foreground, you might want to make it a little bit lighter. So that's when you'd use your exposure compensation, either in manual by choosing the shutter speed or ISO, or in auto by using the exposure value compensation. And then you can change your white balance. Now white balance adds blue cast if you want it cooler, or an orange cast if you want it warmer. Automatic works really well, particularly in daylight, so I'd recommend keep it in automatic. But if you know what you're doing, or for instance, let's say it's a sunset and you want to make the image even warmer, then you can choose manual, and then you can go to a warmer color by moving the slider to the right. And again, if you want it cool and crisp, move it to the left. But auto works pretty well in daylight. Keep it there for most scenarios, unless you know what you're doing. If you're in auto, you can still change your white balance, but to do that, you would choose the three little dots in the top right hand side, go to your camera, and then you've got your white balance, auto or manual there. Before we get the drone in the air, to explain the quick shots and some more advanced features, let's put a grid on our camera. And to do that, press the three little dots in the settings, choose camera tab, and then you can choose grid lines. I generally use this middle one, the rule of thirds, and now you can see you've got the grid line showing. Makes it easier to get some great composition. Some other settings, if we go back into camera, you've got an overexposure warning. If you turn that on, then you'll see these little zebras. That tells you you've overexposed, i.e. it's far too bright and you can bring your exposure down with the methods that we explained earlier. So you can leave that on too if you wish. For the purpose of this video though, I'm turning them both off. So we're in the air and you can simply record, like I said earlier, just by pressing the record button, and then you can fly around and make your recordings. You can use your tilt function on the front here to tilt up and down. Let's have a look though at the quick shot modes. There's 5 pre-programmed flight paths that you can use for great cinematic footage, very simply. To do that, we first want to press this little icon and choose quick shots. There's 5 that you can choose from. If you scroll, you can see all 5. With all of the quick shots, all you need to do is select your subject or person, and you do that by either tapping if there's a little green icon or dragging around it with your finger. That's now going to track that point, and then you press start. It starts recording, it makes the moves, and it stops recording, and on some modes returns back to its starting point. On other modes, the starting point and the ending point are the same. I've got an in-depth video on all of the quick shots. You can check that on the right hand side at the end of the video, but let's give you a quick overview on all of them. So the drone is the first one, and that moves up and away from you, and you set on the left hand side how far you want to move away. Next one we have is the rocket. The rocket just shoots straight up in the air, and you can set how high you want it to go here. With the circle, position the drone where you want to start. Closer to the subject, smaller circle, quicker time. Further away, larger circle, longer time. You can choose the direction on the screen by choosing these arrows clockwise or anti-clockwise, and then press start. It will record, do the circle and stop recording. Helix is similar, only this time it revolves around and goes out and up. Again, you set the parameters of how far away you want it, but the starting point is where the drone is. And then you have the drone quick shot. That's an oval shape. It starts where the drone is and it shoots out and up and returns back and comes down lower, just like the shape of a boomerang if you throw it. Let's explain then the cine, normal and sport mode on the controller, and that's slow, medium and fast speed for all of the movements, whether it's rotating, moving left, right, back and forward, or the camera rotating up and down. Okay, let's take a look. So let's start with cine. This is a good place to start when you very first start filming and using your drone, because it's slow and it's smooth. So if you go forward on the joystick all the way, it's still nice and slow and smooth. If we turn left and right, it's very slow. And if we use the button at the front for tilting the angle, it's slow and it's smooth. Now if we change to normal mode, that's normal speed, it's a bit faster. So let's go forward on this one. Let's rotate the gimbal. And let's rotate left and right. So you can see it's a lot faster. And then we have the fastest mode, that's sport mode. I generally use this to get to and from the locations. But if you want to film fast moving subjects like vehicles, boats, dogs, children, then you can use this to follow them as well. Let's show you the speed of this. If we go forward, very fast. If we rotate the gimbal, really fast. And if we tilt the gimbal, you can see it's really fast. Let's look at the brightness controls that we explained earlier then, and we'll start with the auto mode. So we're in video, we're in auto mode. Now I've got some bright sky and I've got some darker foreground. So let's press the exposure value and use this slider now to come darker if you're exposing for the brighter parts of the image, or we can come lighter if you're exposing for the darker parts of the image. And if we go back into Pro mode, then we can change the shutter speed and we can make that faster, which darkens down the image, or slower, which lightens up the image. And if you want to, you can change the ISO. We're on the minimum, which is the best setting, 100. But if we move that to the right hand side, you can see that we increase the exposure, and we need to compensate by bringing down the shutter speed. Let's show you the exposure lock then whilst we're filming. So let's say this is the exposure. We can see plus 0.3. That's what we like. Well, tap once, tap again. That's locked that exposure value. And now we can move the gimbal around to any brightness and it's still going to remain exactly the same. And that's useful because you don't then get the changes in exposure where it goes darker and lighter during filming. So if the light is fairly stable, fairly constant, that's a good thing to do, set your exposure lock. But if it's variable and changing all of the time, if there's clouds in the sky for instance and it's getting darker and lighter, then you might want to keep that on auto, but the choice is yours, you have the flexibility. And let's show you the white balance then manually. So if we go to Pro mode, we choose the white balance, choose manual, and then if we go to the left, you'll see it gets cooler, and if we go to the right, it gets warmer. This is a great thing to try out, especially for sunsets. Have a play around, move that slider to the right, you'll really bring out the oranges and yellows in the sky, and you'll get some great creative video. Another thing you can do is you can set up the function button here on the left to automatically change the direction that the camera's looking from straight forward to straight down. Double clicking, the camera looks straight down, double click again, it looks straight forward. So it's a quick way to set the camera for you. And to do that, we're going to the settings of 3 dots, go into the control tab, and then if you scroll down a little bit, where it says button customization, you can choose what happens when you press it once and what happens when you double tap it. So I have automatic exposure lock. That's really useful because we talked about exposure locking. All you need to do is press it once if you have that set up and it locks the exposure. Press it again and it unlocks the exposure. Easier than tapping and holding the screen. Double tap, then it recenters the gimbal looking forward. Another double tap, it looks straight down. And finally, while we're in the control tab, you can change the gimbal to FPV, that's first person view mode. The default is follow mode, and what happens in follow mode is the gimbal remains horizontal, so it doesn't move like an aeroplane would. It moves left and right and it moves up and down, but on the horizontal axis it remains stable. If you change that over to FPV mode, the gimbal will move and tilt left and right in flight. Let's give you a demonstration. So that was all the video modes for the DJI Mini 2. Hope that was useful. Join me again next time. Take care.